The day I learned the land was finally mine, I also learned someone else had already claimed it. Not with a fence or a handshake, but with a mansion rising out of my inherited lake ranch like a declaration of war. The HOA called it a misunderstanding. The neighbors called it progress. But every document I uncovered told a darker story, one built on arrogance, assumptions, and a belief that power could replace ownership. What none of them expected was a single survey line that would turn confidence into panic. And when that line was revealed, everything unraveled. Before any letters arrived or lines were drawn on the maps, life on the lake ranch moved at a quiet, predictable rhythm. The property came to me through inheritance, not ambition. 1,500 acres of water, grass, and tree-lined shoreline passed down with more history than instructions. It wasn't polished or manicured. It didn't try to impress. It simply existed the way it always had, wide, patient, and unconcerned about anyone else's opinion. I didn't move in with grand plans. The ranch wasn't a development opportunity or a status symbol. It was space. Space to breathe, to think, and to finally feel untethered from the noise that has followed me for years. Most days were spent walking the shoreline, repairing old fencing, and learning the land the way you learn a person, slowly through observation rather than force. The lake reflected the sky the same way every morning, and silence felt earned. At the far edges of the property, things began to change. New roads appeared first, then survey flags, then construction equipment parked where cattle once grazed. It didn't initially feel threatening. Growth has a way of presenting itself as progress, and I had no interest in micromanaging land I wasn't actively using. The ranch was large enough to coexist with neighbors I barely knew. The surrounding community, however, was changing faster than the land itself. What had once been scattered homes and seasonal cabins was now branded as a luxury lakeside enclave. Signs appeared with polished logos and promises of exclusivity. An HOA quietly took shape, presenting itself as a guardian of property values and order. From a distance, it all seemed irrelevant. The ranch predated their rules, their boundaries, and their sense of authority at first. The interactions were polite and forgettable. Occasional emails, friendly waves from people driving past inexpensive SUVs. Nothing that suggested conflict. Nothing that suggested anyone believed they had a say over land that had been in my family for generations. The ranch felt insulated from the kind of small-scale politics that thrived in planned communities. But subtle things started to feel off. Construction noise carried me farther than it should have. Trucks crossed areas they weren't supposed to. A shoreline that had always been untouched began to look staged, as if someone else had already imagined how it should be used. No one asked for permission. No one explained. The assumption seemed to be that silence meant consent. The first official communication arrived wrapped in professional language and soft assurances. It referenced shared boundaries, community standards, and future alignment. It didn't accuse or demand, it simply assumed participation. The HOA wasn't introducing itself as a neighbor. It was introducing itself as an authority that had already decided where I fit. I remember rereading that message more than once, not because it was confusing, but because it was unsettling. There was confidence in it. Confidence that didn't come from facts I recognized. It spoke as if the land had already been accounted for, as if decisions had already been finalized somewhere I hadn't been invited. Still, I didn't push back. Not yet. The ranch taught me patience. And patience, I believe, would keep things simple. I trusted that clear ownership and long-standing records would speak for themselves if needed. After all, land doesn't forget who it belongs to. What I didn't realize was that while I was walking the shoreline and restoring old paths, someone else was building a future on assumptions. And buried beneath those assumptions was a belief that paperwork could be bent, boundaries could be blurred, and silence could be mistaken for surrender. The ranch was calm, too calm, and just beyond that calm, something permanent was already rising without permission, without certainty, and without any idea how quickly its foundation would be questioned. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in through paperwork, tone, and timing. What had once felt like distant activity at the edge of the ranch began moving closer, not physically, but administratively. The HOA's presence became harder to ignore, not because they announced themselves loudly, but because they started acting as if they had always been there. It began with rules I had never agreed to. Notices arrived referencing architectural standards, shoreline usage limits, and environmental compliance requirements. They weren't framed as suggestions. They were written as reminders, as if I had already missed meetings or signed documents I'd never seen. The language was polished and confident, the kind that assumes resistance is unlikely because authority is implied rather than stated at first. The rules seemed almost irrelevant to me. Restrictions on dock sizes, approved vegetation lists, noise limitations are tied to community enjoyment. None of it matched the reality of a ranch that stretched farther than their entire development combined. The absurdity was almost entertaining. Almost, because each notice comes with deadlines, and each deadline comes with consequences. The first fine appeared quietly, buried at the bottom of an email, a modest amount, justified as a compliance fee for unapproved land use activity. No explanation beyond a vague reference to shoreline disturbance. I hadn't touched the shoreline, Nothing has changed. But the fine wasn't really about money. It was about precedent. Paying it would mean acknowledging their reach. Ignoring it would mean an escalation. I chose silence, believing facts would eventually matter. That belief didn't slow them down. It encouraged them soon. Notices became more frequent, weekly, then bi-weekly, each one referencing a different violation, each one more confident than the last. Unauthorized access roads, improper land grading, non-compliant structures. The irony was suffocating. I was being cited for changes I hadn't made, while someone else's construction continued uninterrupted, growing taller and more elaborate with each passing week. That construction stopped feeling hypothetical. When I finally saw it up close, a mansion was not a home. Massive, deliberate, and planted near the lake as if it had always belonged there. Its footprint extended farther than I expected, farther than it should have been. It wasn't just near my land. It felt embedded in it, as if the boundary itself had been rewritten with sheer confidence. The HOA treated it as a centerpiece. Their communications praised it as a future landmark, a symbol of the community's vision. They referenced it when discussing property values and aesthetic standards. It was protected, celebrated, and defended. Meanwhile, I was warned about tree placement and soil disruption on land that had been untouched for decades. When I questioned the inconsistency, the responses grew colder, less explanation, more repetition. The same phrases were recycled with minor variations, all pointing back to their authority. They spoke of maps and surveys they had on file, documents that supposedly justified everything, documents I was never shown. That the fines have increased, late fees stacked onto violations I refused to acknowledge, threats of liens were introduced casually, as if they were routine maintenance rather than legal pressure. The HOA wasn't trying to resolve anything. They were trying to overwhelm, to make resistance feel exhausting, to turn patience into compliance. Neighbors began to shift. Waves disappeared. Conversations have shortened. People who once seemed indifferent now watch more closely. The narrative had changed and I wasn't controlling it. In their version, I wasn't an owner protecting inherited land. I was an obstacle. Someone stood in the way of progress, harmony, and a shared vision. The most unsettling moment came when access to parts of the ranch was suddenly blocked. Temporary fencing appeared where none had been before. Signs referencing approved construction zones and safety restrictions. They weren't subtle. They were bold, placed as if no one expected them to be challenged. The message was clear. Decisions had already been made. That was when frustration hardened into determination. I stopped assuming clarity would emerge on its own. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, encroachments, the exact locations of equipment and materials. Patterns emerged quickly, and they all pointed in the same direction. The mansion wasn't just close to my land, it was on it still. The HOA denied everything. Their confidence never wavered. They continued issuing fines, continued defending the construction, continued referencing boundaries that existed only in their communications. It was as if reality itself had become non-negotiable. The pressure mounted. Legal language intensified. Deadlines shortened. The threat of enforcement loomed larger with every message. They spoke of remedies and actions, of consequences that would follow if I didn't fall in line. The tone wasn't angry. It was assured. They believed the outcome was inevitable. What they didn't know was that while they were escalating administratively, I was preparing quietly. Old records were pulled. County filings were reviewed. Historical surveys are examined line by line. The ranch's history wasn't just sentimental. It was documented, layered, and precise. The land remembered what the HOA had chosen to forget. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the dispute wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about assumptions. The assumption was that size meant authority, that new documents outweighed the older ones, that confidence could replace consent. And at the center of it all was that mansion, rising steadily, confidently, as if nothing could touch it. It cast a long shadow over the lake, one that felt less like progress and more like entitlement solidified into stone. Every notice, every fine, every barrier they placed pushed the situation closer to a breaking point. The HOA believed pressure would end resistance. They believed silence meant weakness. They believed the land would eventually yield. What they couldn't see was that beneath all their paperwork and posturing, one undeniable truth was waiting to surface. And when it did, it wouldn't just challenge their authority. It would redraw everything they thought they owned. The breaking point arrived not with a shout, but with a letter thick enough to feel heavy before it was opened. The HOA escalated from suggestion to threat, from fines to formal action. They claimed the right to enforce compliance through liens, injunctions, and access restrictions. They outlined the consequences with clinical precision, as if the outcome had already been decided and this was merely a courtesy notice. The confidence in their language wasn't bluster anymore. It was an expectation. By then, the mansion was nearly complete. Its stone exterior gleamed against the lake, windows reflecting sunlight like trophies. It stood exactly where it had no right to stand, yet no one involved acted uncertainly. The HOA circulated photos of it in community updates, presenting it as proof of vision realized. They spoke of it as if it was untouchable, as if its existence alone validated it. Every boundary they had quietly redrawn. That was when the survey arrived. Not the one the HOA referenced, not the one embedded in their emails and filings. This survey came from the county archives, cross-referenced with historical plats and modern measurements. It wasn't flashy. It didn't try to impress. It was precise, methodical, and devastatingly clear. The boundary line didn't bend. It wasn't complicated. It cut directly through the manicured lawn, across the foundation, and into the heart of the mansion itself. The structure wasn't near my land. It was on it. The realization didn't bring immediate relief. It brought a strange calm, the kind that comes when uncertainty finally collapses into fact. Everything the HOA had built its authority on suddenly felt fragile. Their rules, their fines, their threats, all depended on a version of reality that no longer held. The moment the findings were submitted, the tone shifted. Not publicly, not yet. But the responses slowed. The automated confidence faltered. Requests for documentation were met with silence. Deadlines were quietly extended without explanation. The HOA didn't acknowledge the survey directly. They couldn't. To do so would be to admit that their most celebrated project rested on borrowed ground. The confrontation came in a setting designed for project control. A formal review meeting. Long tables. Stacked documents. Officials who had never set foot on the ranch suddenly spoke with authority about its limits. The HOA presented their materials first, repeating familiar claims with practiced ease. Maps were displayed. Boundaries were highlighted. Confidence radiates outward, as if repetition alone could make it true. Then the county survey was introduced. The room changed, not dramatically, not with outrage or disbelief. It changed the way the air changes before a storm. Attention narrowed, eyes lingered, calculations replaced certainty. The lines on the map didn't align with the HOA narrative. It ignored their assumptions. It traced history instead of convenience. The mansion's footprint was unmistakable. Every inch of encroachment was documented. Every claim to authority suddenly inverted. The structure they had defended wasn't a symbol of progress. It was evidence. Attempts were made to reframe the issue, to suggest clerical errors, to imply outdated records. But the survey had been verified, stamped, and cross-checked. It didn't argue, it simply existed. And its existence dismantled months of pressure in seconds. The power dynamic flipped without ceremony. The HOA's posture tightened. Their representatives stopped speaking in absolutes. Words like remedy and cooperation replaced enforcement. Threats that once flowed freely now felt risky. They weren't holding any leverage anymore. They were exposed. The true shock wasn't legal. It was social. Word spread quickly. The same neighbors who had watched from a distance now paid attention. The mansion that had been marketed as aspirational became controversial overnight. The story shifted from resistance to overreach, from stubborn landowner to inheritance boundary ignored. The HOA's credibility cracked, and once cracked, it couldn't be patched quietly. The owner of the mansion, once shielded by the HOA's authority, was suddenly isolated. The confidence that had fueled the construction evaporated. The assumption that no one would challenge the boundaries collapsed under the weight of public documentation. What had been built as a statement now stood as a liability. The HOA attempts damage control, emergency meetings, revised communications, appealed to unity, but the narrative was no longer theirs to manage. The survey didn't just challenge a structure, it challenged the process. It raised questions about every decision made under assumed authority. If this boundary had been ignored, what else had been glossed over? The climax wasn't loud. It didn't require raised voices or dramatic exits. It unfolded through realization, through the quiet understanding that the HOA had overplayed its hand. They had pushed too far, too confidently, and in doing so had forced a level of scrutiny they could no longer withstand. The final blow came not from retaliation, but from inevitability. Legal filings followed the survey's conclusions. The encroachment was undeniable. The remedies were limited. The main could not remain where it stood without consent. That would never be G. What had been framed as unassailable progress was now an unsolvable problem. The HOA's threats vanished entirely. The fines were rescinded without explanation. Communications have ceased. The authority that had once pressed so hard now retreated into silence. Their power had depended on ambiguity, and ambiguity had gone. Standing on the shoreline, looking at the structure that had caused so much disruption, the feeling wasn't triumph. It was vindication tempered by clarity. The land didn't need to defend itself through aggression. It had defended itself through truth, through records, through lines that refused to move just because someone wanted them to. The mansion still stood, but it no longer felt imposing. It felt temporary, a monument to assumption, waiting for a consequence. And as reality settled in, one thing became clear. The fight wasn't over yet, but it would never belong to the HOA again. The resolution didn't arrive with celebration or applause. It arrived slowly, the way truth tends to settle once there's nothing left to obscure it. After the survey stripped away the HOA's confidence, the entire landscape of power changed, not just legally, but psychologically. The organization that had once acted with unquestioned authority now moved cautiously, as if every step required permission it no longer had. Formal proceedings followed, but they were no longer a battle, they were a formality. The encroachment was documented beyond dispute, and remedies were dictated by law rather than preference. The mansion, once showcased as the crown jewel of the community's future, was officially deemed not by HOA rules, but by reality itself. Its foundations sat where it never belonged, and no amount of paperwork could make that disappear. The outcome was unavoidable. Portions of the structure had to be removed, the shoreline restored, the land returned to its original boundary. What had been built with confidence was dismantled with caution. Construction crews returned, not to expand or refine, but to undo. The same trucks that once symbolized unchecked progress now carried away stone and steel in silence. The HOA did not issue an apology. They didn't acknowledge their fault publicly. Instead, they retreated into procedural language and revised bylaws. The committees were reorganized. Leadership quietly shifted. The tone of their communications softened, stripped of the authority they once wielded so freely. They stopped issuing fines without airtight justification. They stopped assuming compliance. They learned, too late, that the authority borrowed from assumption collapses the moment it's questioned. For the surrounding community, the impact was immediate and lasting. Neighbors who had once watched passively began asking questions. Boundaries were re-examined. Records were requested. The illusion of infallibility was shattered, replaced by a more cautious awareness of what power actually meant and what it didn't. An organization that had thrived on confidence now faced scrutiny at every turn. The mansion's owner faded from prominence. What had once been a symbol of influence became a lesson whispered rather than admired. The spectacle of removal lingered in memory far longer than the original construction ever did. People remembered how quickly certainty turned into vulnerability when facts were introduced. How silence, once mistaken for weakness, had actually been a restraint. As for the ranch, it returned to stillness. The shoreline recovered. The land breathed again. The old paths were reopened. The temporary barriers removed. Nothing new was added. Nothing flashy replaced what had been taken away. Restoration wasn't about reclaiming space, it was about re-establishing continuity. The ranch had outlasted trends, developments, and assumptions before. It would continue to do so. The most profound change wasn't visible. It was internal. The experience reshaped how power was understood, not as something granted by committees or enforced through fines, but as something rooted in legitimacy. The HOA relied on complexity to intimidate, on volume to overwhelm. But complexity crumbles under clarity. And volume means nothing when the truth speaks quietly and precisely. Time passed, and the situation became a reference point. New disputes were measured against it. New leaders acted with their memory in mind. The ranch's boundaries became a fixed reference, not just on maps, but in conversations about limits and respect. What had begun as a conflict over land ended as a recalibration of authority. There was no desire for revenge, no satisfaction in watching others scramble. The resolution wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance. The land didn't need dominance to be defended. It needed recognition. Once that recognition was forced into the open, everything else followed naturally. Looking back, the most striking realization was how close everything came to going unchallenged. How easily assumptions could have hardened into precedent. How silence could have been mistaken for consent forever. The HOA didn't rely on malice. It relied on momentum, on the idea that no one would slow things down enough to ask uncomfortable questions. That was the true lesson. Power that isn't questioned expands until it's forced to stop. Authority that isn't examined assumes it deserves compliance. And real land, with history and record, doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to truth. The dispute ended, but its impact endured. It reminded everyone involved that ownership isn't defined by confidence, and boundaries aren't decided by convenience. They are drawn by fact, preserved by patience, and defended by those willing to look past noise and stand still long enough to see clearly. The ranch remains. The lake still reflects the sky the same way it always has, and where a mansion once tried to claim permanence through assumption, there is now open ground, quiet, unremarkable, and exactly where it belongs, because in the end, the most powerful thing in the dispute wasn't a lawsuit, a fine, or a threat. It was a single line on a map that refused to move, no matter how badly someone wanted it to.